What happens when one of Hollywood's most unpredictable actors meets a talk show host who thinks he can push any guest around? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had security called to the studio and left one A-list actor walking off set in the middle of a live taping. This is the story of how Jimmy Kimmel's arrogance finally met its match. But before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because what you're about to hear will blow your mind. It was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance. Nicolas Cage was making the rounds for his latest film, and Jimmy Kimmel Live was just another stop on the publicity tour. But from the moment Cage walked onto that stage, something felt different. The usual pre-interview banter backstage had been curt, almost hostile. Kimmel's producers had briefed him on some talking points, but what they hadn't prepared him for was Cage's mood that evening. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Nicolas Cage," Kimmel announced with his trademark smirk, but there was already something condescending in his tone. The audience erupted in applause as Cage strode onto the stage, his leather jacket catching the studio lights. He sat down across from Kimmel, and the energy in the room immediately shifted. "Nicolas, great to have you back on the show," Kimmel began, leaning back in his chair with that familiar air of superiority he wore like a second skin. "I have to ask, and the audience is dying to know, do you ever get tired of people making fun of your acting choices?" The question hit like a slap. It wasn't the warm-up question that guests typically expected. Cage's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained controlled. "Jimmy, I think there's a difference between artistic risk-taking and what people perceive as quote-unquote crazy performances. My approach to acting has always been about finding truth in the character, even if that truth makes people uncomfortable." Kimmel chuckled, but it wasn't friendly. "Right, but come on, Nicolas. The internet is filled with memes of you screaming. You've got to admit some of your choices are, well, let's call them interesting." "Interesting," Cage repeated, his jaw tightening. "That's one way to put it. Another way would be to say that I'm committed to my craft in a way that challenges conventional expectations. Not everyone appreciates that level of dedication." "Dedication, sure," Kimmel said, waving his hand dismissively. "But there's a line between dedication and, I don't know, whatever it was you were doing in that vampire movie. What was it called again? Something with terrible reviews?" The audience laughed, but Cage didn't. "Jimmy, are you here to promote my current project, or are you here to tear down my body of work for cheap laughs?" Kimmel's smile faltered for just a second before snapping back into place. "Hey, I'm just having fun with you, Nicolas. Don't take it so seriously. The audience loves this stuff." "The audience," Cage said slowly, "deserves better than a host who builds his reputation by belittling his guests. I've been in this industry for over 4 decades. I've worked with some of the greatest directors and actors of our time. I don't need to sit here while you reduce my career to punchlines." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Kimmel shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. "Look, Nicolas, this is all in good fun. You're being a little sensitive, don't you think?" "Sensitive?" Cage's voice rose slightly, that famous intensity beginning to surface. "Jimmy, let me tell you something about sensitivity. When you've poured your heart and soul into a character, when you've spent months preparing for a role, studying every nuance, every emotional beat, and then you have some comedian who's never stepped foot on a real film set reducing that work to internet memes. Yeah, I get a little sensitive." Kimmel tried to regain control, but his usual tactics weren't working. Okay, let's move on. Tell us about your new movie. What's it about?" "Now you want to talk about my actual work?" Cage asked, his tone sharp. "After spending the first 5 minutes of this interview trying to humiliate me in front of your audience?" "I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone," Kimmel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is how talk shows work, Nicolas. We joke around, we have fun." "Fun for who, Jimmy?" Fun for you while you tear down someone else's life's work? Fun for your audience while they watch you bully a guest? Let me ask you something. When was the last time you created anything meaningful? When was the last time you put yourself on the line artistically? The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense they were witnessing something unprecedented. Kimmel's face flushed red, his composure cracking. I create comedy every single night. I entertain millions of people. You mock people every single night, Cage corrected him. There's a difference between entertainment and cruelty, Jimmy. What you do isn't comedy, it's a roast disguised as an interview. You invite people onto your show under the pretense of promotion, and then you ambush them with ridicule. Kimmel's hands clenched into fists on his desk. You know what, Nicholas? Maybe you should have stayed home if you can't handle a little ribbing. This is television. People expect us to be entertaining. Entertaining, Cage repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You want to know what's not entertaining, Jimmy? Watching a grown man hide behind his desk while he takes cheap shots at artists who have the courage to take risks. You want to know what's not entertaining? Sitting here listening to someone who's never taken a real creative risk in his life. Lecture me about my choices. The confrontation was escalating beyond anything the show's producers had ever witnessed. In the control room, panicked voices were discussing whether to cut to commercial, but the raw drama unfolding on stage was too compelling to interrupt. This wasn't scripted banter, this was two men at war, and Nicolas Cage was winning. Kimmel's jaw dropped. In all his years of hosting, no guest had ever spoken to him like this on his own show. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to laugh or gasp. But Nicolas Cage wasn't finished. You know what your problem is, Jimmy? Cage continued, leaning forward in his chair. You think because you have a platform, because you have an audience, that gives you the right to humiliate people. You've built your entire career on punching down, on making people feel small so you can feel big. Kimmel's face was turning a deeper shade of red. That's completely unfair, Nicholas. I treat all my guests with respect. Respect? Cage laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jimmy, you opened this interview by asking me if I ever get tired of people making fun of my work. That's your idea of respect? You couldn't even pretend to care about my new project before you started your little comedy routine. I was building up to it, Kimmel stammered, clearly flustered. That's how interviews work. You start with something light, something fun. Something light? Cage's voice was rising again, that famous intensity burning brighter. Jimmy, my work isn't a punchline for your amusement. Every role I take, every choice I make as an actor, it comes from a place of deep commitment and artistic exploration. When you mock that, you're not being light, you're being cruel. The studio audience was completely silent now. Some people were pulling out their phones, sensing they were witnessing television history. Kimmel tried to regain his composure, straightening his tie and forcing a smile. Look, Nicholas, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. Let's start over. Tell us about your new film. Start over? Cage shook his head slowly. Jimmy, you don't get to humiliate someone and then just start over when it backfires. You don't get to throw punches and then call timeout when your opponent fights back. I wasn't throwing punches, Kimmel protested weakly. I was just having some fun with your reputation. My reputation, Cage repeated, his eyes narrowing. Jimmy, let me tell you about reputation. I've won an Academy Award. I've worked with directors like David Lynch, Spike Jonze, and the Coen brothers. I've created characters that have moved audiences around the world. What have you done besides make jokes about other people's achievements? The attack was surgical and devastating. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I've built a successful television show. I've interviewed presidents and movie stars. You've built a show based on tearing people down, Cage shot back. You invite artists onto your stage, and then mock their art. You bring on musicians and make fun of their songs. You have actors sit in your guest chair and then treat their life's work like a joke. That's not success, Jimmy. That's exploitation. Kimmel was losing control of the situation completely. His producers were frantically gesturing from off stage, but he ignored them. You're being ridiculous, Nicholas. Comedy has always involved poking fun at celebrities. It's part of the game. The game? Cage stood up suddenly, towering over Kimmel's desk. Jimmy, this isn't a game. This is my life. This is my career. These are roles that I've poured my heart and soul into, and you treat them like they're some kind of elaborate joke that only you're smart enough to get. The audience gasped. This was unprecedented. Guests didn't stand up during interviews. They certainly didn't tower over the host like Cage was doing now. Kimmel shrank back in his chair, suddenly looking very small. Sit down, Nicholas, Kimmel said, his voice shaky. You're making a scene. I'm making a scene? Cage's laugh was sharp and bitter. Jimmy, you made a scene the moment you decided to ambush me with your tired comedy routine. You made a scene when you chose to mock my work instead of celebrating it. You made a scene when you decided that your ego was more important than basic human decency. This is my show, Kimmel said, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. You can't talk to me like this on my own show. Your show, Cage nodded slowly. That's the problem right there, Jimmy. You think because it's your show, because your name is on the marquee, that gives you the right to treat people however you want. Well, let me tell you something about show business that maybe nobody ever taught you. Respect isn't something you demand because you have a title. Respect is something you earn through your actions. Kimmel was sweating now, his usual confidence completely shattered. I think you should sit down and calm down, Nicholas. Calm down? Cage's voice boomed through the studio. Jimmy, I am calm. This is me calm. You want to see me not calm? Keep pushing. Keep trying to turn my artistic journey into your personal comedy hour. Keep treating me like I'm here for your amusement instead of as a professional who deserves basic respect. The tension in the room was electric. Security guards had quietly moved closer to the stage, though no one was sure who they were there to protect. Kimmel looked around desperately as if hoping someone would rescue him from the situation he had created. I think we should go to commercial, Kimmel said weakly, reaching for his cue cards. Oh no, Jimmy, Cage said, placing his hand firmly on the desk and leaning down until he was eye level with the terrified host. You wanted to have this conversation on television. You wanted to make a spectacle of my career. Well, now you've got a spectacle. Now you've got a real conversation about what it means to be an artist in an industry full of people who think creativity is something to be mocked. The control room was in chaos. Producers were shouting conflicting instructions. Technicians were frozen at their posts, and everyone was trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. But on stage, Nicolas Cage was just getting started. You know what, Jimmy? Cage said, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. I've been in this business long enough to spot a bully when I see one. And that's exactly what you are. You hide behind your desk, behind your writers, behind your audience, and you take shots at people who can't fight back because they need the publicity. Kimmel's hands were trembling now. Nicholas, please just sit down. We can work this out. Work this out? Cage's laugh was cold. Jimmy, the only thing we're working out here is the fact that you're a coward. You invited me on your show to promote my work, and instead you decided to turn me into your personal punching bag. Well, guess what? I punch back. The audience was, completely captivated. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was raw, unfiltered confrontation. Phones were recording from every angle, capturing what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about television moment of the year. I don't know what you want from me, Kimmel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to be honest, Cage replied, his intensity dialing up another notch. I want you to admit that you brought me on this show not to celebrate my work, but to mock it. I want you to admit that you see artists as nothing more than content for your comedy mill. I want you to admit that you don't respect the craft, you don't respect the process, and you certainly don't respect the people who dedicate their lives to creating something meaningful." Kimmel looked around desperately. "This is completely unprofessional." "Nicholas? Unprofessional?" Cage's voice boomed through the studio. "Jimmy, what's unprofessional is ambushing a guest with hostile questions. What's unprofessional is building your career on the backs of artists who are trying to promote their work. What's unprofessional is treating creativity like it's some kind of disease that needs to be cured with your particular brand of mediocrity." The host was completely shell-shocked. In all his years of television, he had never encountered a guest who refused to play along with his routine. "I think you should leave," he said weakly. "Leave?" Cage straightened up, his full height imposing over the cowering host. "Jimmy, I was planning to leave the moment I walked in here and saw what kind of show you really run. But you know what? I'm glad this happened. I'm glad your audience got to see who you really are when someone stands up to you." "Security!" Kimmel called out, his voice cracking. "Can we get security up here?" "Security?" Cage turned to look at the guards who had been edging closer to the stage. "You're calling security because I hurt your feelings, because I exposed your little game? Jimmy, you're pathetic." The security guards hesitated, unsure of what to do. Cage wasn't being physically threatening, he was just speaking passionately. But Kimmel was clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had developed. "You want me to leave, Jimmy?" Cage asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Fine, I'll leave. But first, let me tell your audience something that you never will. Art matters. Creativity matters. When an actor takes on a role, when they transform themselves into a character, when they bear their soul on screen, that's not something to be mocked. That's something to be celebrated." He turned to face the audience directly, his presence commanding the entire studio. "And when someone invites you onto their show to promote your work, you have the right to expect basic respect. You have the right to expect that they'll treat your craft with dignity. You don't have to sit there and smile while they turn your life's passion into their personal joke." The audience was mesmerized. Some were nodding in agreement. Others were simply stunned by the raw emotion they were witnessing. Cage turned back to Kimmel, who was now slumped in his chair like a defeated opponent. "Jimmy, I hope you learned something tonight," Cage said, his voice now eerily calm. "I hope you learned that not every guest is going to play along with your little comedy routine. I hope you learned that artists are human beings with feelings, not just content for your show. And I hope you learned that when you mess with someone's life's work, you better be prepared for them to defend it." Kimmel could only stare as Cage began to walk away from the interview area. But the actor wasn't quite finished. He stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. "Oh, and Jimmy," Cage called out, his voice carrying across the silent studio, "next time you want to make fun of someone's acting choices, maybe try acting yourself first. Then you'll understand what it takes to create something real." With that, Nicolas Cage walked off the stage, leaving behind a shell-shocked host, a stunned audience, and what would go down as one of the most explosive television moments in late-night history. Kimmel sat in his chair for several long seconds, the cameras still rolling, before finally managing to croak out, "We'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone knew there would be no recovery from this. Jimmy Kimmel had finally met his match, and Nicolas Cage had just delivered a masterclass in standing up to bullies. The internet would be talking about this confrontation for years to come, and for once, it wouldn't be about mocking an actor's performance. It would be about celebrating an artist's courage to fight back against a system that had forgotten how to show respect. As the credits rolled on what would become legendary television, one thing was clear. Nicolas Cage had just reminded everyone why he's one of the most fearless performers of his generation, both on screen and off. And Jimmy Kimmel? Well, he had just learned that sometimes the joke is on you. So what do you think? Did Nicolas Cage go too far, or was Jimmy Kimmel asking for it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. Which celebrity do you think would handle a hostile interview the best?